I'm going to introduce someone apparently whose work is known to a number of you, in spite of her having been postdoc for 3 years. She is now has joined the psychology department of Boston College, but for the 3 years preceding, she was a postdoctoral associate in brain and cognitive sciences at MIT and a visiting scholar in the philosophy department at MIT. When I looked at her CV, which I thought she couldn't be telling the truth about having been only 3 years postdoc, an extraordinary range of interests and publications and speeches and so on. Anyway, we're eager to have Liane Young, who's going to talk about when the mind matters for morality.
Thanks. Thanks so much, and I just want to thank Matthew again for organizing this and having me. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here. And thank you, Bill, for the introduction. Bill actually came up to me before and said, you know, I've never met you before. I'm just meeting you now, so I can't give you the introduction that the other folks have been giving. You haven't changed my life, but it looks like you're doing good work, so I thought, great, no expectations, no pressure. I'm, like I said, really excited to be here. I was really excited to see Frances Cam in the audience. She was my undergraduate thesis advisor, but she just came up to me before to say that she had to go to the post office, so she's going to miss my talk. Just too bad. She said, is it going to be normative? And I said, well, kind of. So she said, well, that's okay then. Is there a mic? Because I don't actually want to stand behind the podium. Does this work? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I think like many of you, I'm here studying morality because I think it's really interesting, it's really complicated. One of the many complications of morality is the fact of moral disagreement, both sort of within a single individual person, like Josh talked about, which gives rise to the experience of a moral dilemma, internal conflict, and also, as I'm sure others will talk about, disagreements between people, between cultures. Maybe we'll hear more about that from John Haidt a little bit later on in the event. And again, part of the reason why morality is so interesting is because of all of these complications like moral disagreement. But I think this also makes the job of a moral psychologist particularly tricky. If we want to study the moral mind, the question comes up, whose mind are we going to start studying? And what I want to suggest is that one way into this problem is to instead study a cognitive rule that might apply independent of the specific content of the specific moral code. So for instance, even if I don't know what Josh thinks is morally wrong, or even if we disagree, I know that to Josh's mind, whatever that wrong thing is going to be more wrong when it's done intentionally than accidentally. So I want to say just a bit more about this rule. In general, we care a lot about what someone means to do. So if this character here thinks the powder before her is poison, even though it's just sugar, it's not okay for her to do this, for her to put that powder into somebody's coffee thinking that she's going to end up poisoning someone. So we'll blame her for her guilty attempt, her attempted harm. Innocent intentions count too, so when people cause harm to others by accident, we forgive them, or at least we try. Recently, I've, with the help of many others, started to look at how specific brain regions support our ability to do this, to take mental state information into account when making these judgments of blame and forgiveness. These happen to be the same brain regions as Jim Woodward told us about that support mental state reasoning or theory of mind in non-moral contexts. So here what I'm showing you is an image that shows brain regions that are activated more when people are thinking about other people's mental states, like their thoughts, beliefs, desires, and intentions. In this particular case here, false beliefs over and above other sorts of representations, like physical representations, like false or outdated photographs. Of these regions, one in particular, the right temporal junction, or RTPJ, again, this is a region that Jim just told us about, seems to be especially selective for this process, for representing people's mental states, for predicting and explaining other people's behavior by thinking about their internal subjective states. And what I just want to highlight, and these are findings from many research groups across many labs, is that the RTPJ is selective for processing mental states as opposed to just any socially relevant information like physical appearance or internal subjective sensations like fatigue and hunger. Also, the RTPJ seems to be selective for this higher level process of theory of mind or mental state reasoning as opposed to just other low-level processes like attention to unexpected events. And like I alluded to, using functional MRI, we've begun to see how the RTPJ supports specific aspects of mental state reasoning for moral judgments like those judgments I showed you earlier, judgments of blame and forgiveness for attempted harms and accidents. So just to give you a few examples, the RTPJ supports the encoding of mental states, the inference of mental states, the integration of mental states for moral judgments, and even sort of the reassessment of the status of some mental states, like whether a belief is justified or unjustified after a moral judgment has been made. Okay, and in a number of recent extensions, we've begun to look at how and when moral judgments go awry by modulating activity in the RTPJ. So here we used a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to transiently disrupt activity in this region to then look at the impact on people's moral judgments. So again, the prediction is that if this particular region is responsible for processing mental states, when we disrupt activity in this region, then we should see moral judgments that are based less on mental states and more on outcomes. And that's the pattern that we see. Just to remind you guys, accidental harms or accidents are characterized by good intentions generally and bad outcomes. And attempted harms are characterized by bad intentions and good outcomes. And so what we see here, for example, is that when we disrupt activity in the RTPJ, people tend to judge accidents as more permissible, more okay, because no actual harm was done, even though somebody tried to hurt someone. We find a very similar pattern in moral judgments of high-functioning autistics, such that, and again, autism is characterized by impairments in social interaction and theory of mind, mental state reasoning. And so what we see here is that individuals with autism judge accidents to be more permissible, again, based more on the salient bad outcome as opposed to the innocent intent, the fact that someone didn't mean to cause harm. Recently, we've found sort of the opposite pattern in criminal psychopaths. So these folks actually judge accidents to be more permissible, delivering an almost hyper-rational, intent-based moral judgment. And we think this is due to the fact that psychopaths have a diminished emotional response to the harm and suffering of the victim. In this case, the victim of an accident. So typically, we think the rational response is to forgive and forget, to override a sort of emotional response to the harm that's done, given that they didn't mean to do it. And it seems like psychopaths show that response to the extreme, and I'm hoping that maybe James Blair will tell us a little bit more about why that is. And then finally, patients with focal damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. We heard a little bit about these folks from Josh and Jim earlier. When we tested these folks on the same sorts of scenarios that varied the dimension of intent and outcome, we found that these participants actually judged failed attempts to harm, including failed murder attempts, as more morally permissible. So this would be a case where a normal moral judgment would depend on a sort of emotional response to abstract information, in this case abstract mental state information, and this is where we see a difference between populations. This is also consistent with prior work suggesting that damage to this region leads to impaired processing of abstract information. And again, in our case, the abstract information here is information about unobservable mental states as opposed to concrete information about outcomes, external effects on the world. But for all of that detail, the point that I want to emphasize here is that intentions, mental states really do matter a lot for moral judgments. And a really easy way to see that from these graphs is to see that accidents are almost always judged as better than attempted harms. So good intentions trump outcome information in almost all of these cases, even in the case of the deficits, with the one exception of the VMPC patients here who really show the opposite pattern in their judgments of accidents and attempts. So far the background that I've shown you is that moral judgments really do depend on specific brain regions that support our ability to think about other people's mental states, like their beliefs and intentions and desires. And I started this talk by explaining a little bit about why I study mental states, which is that mental states seem to represent, on some level, this cognitive constant over the mess of human morality. But I'm going to spend the rest of the talk unraveling that story and then hopefully picking the pieces back together. So I'll show you when mental states do matter for moral judgments and also when they don't, with the overall aim of, I hope, providing insight into the functions of mental state reasoning and moral judgments. So I'm going to do this by focusing on two, maybe three more specific questions. The first is whether mental states matter differently depending on the moral domain or the nature of the act. So here I'm going to look at two domains as case studies: the domain of harm, which includes acts that harm other people, like poisoning them or whatever, and also the domain of purity, which includes acts that are offensive not because they're harmful per se, but still seem to defile our moral selves. So incest, eating taboo foods, and so on. And then second, I'm going to probe different perspectives on moral agents. Do we think about our own thoughts differently from how we think about the thoughts of other people? So last night, this talk was an hour long, and I had a third section too, which was on how we attribute mental states to groups of people versus individuals, and in-groups versus out-groups. And then I got an email from Matthew saying that the talk should be significantly shorter, so I cut that out, and I might have overshot, so we might end up with like a 10-minute talk, in which case I will go back to that section, but I've cut it out for now. Okay, so in general, in paradigmatic cases of harm, at least one person harms at least one other person in this sort of moral dyad. And the victim can demand an explanation from the perpetrator, who might appeal to her innocent intentions. And so intent in this case can afford explanations and evaluations of past actions, and also predictions of future actions. Is this person going to help me or hurt me in the future? Oops. And so reasoning about intent seems really useful in interpersonal contexts. When one person's actions affect another, you want to know what's going on inside and not just what actually happened. By contrast, purity violations like incest and eating taboo foods, maybe horse meat or dog meat in some cultures, might be different from harms insofar as, again, like I said, they aren't necessarily deemed morally offensive because there are victims. In many of these cases, there are no victims, and yet we still judge these actions to be wrong, and maybe we'll hear more about that from John Haidt tomorrow. So the idea here is that even when we think about doing these things ourselves accidentally, they still feel morally wrong in the absence of any victims. So in a lot of these cases, only the people who participate in the act are directly affected. So the people who eat the forbidden foods or the people who sleep with the forbidden partners. And so it's possible that while intent really plays a key role in our moral judgments of harmful interpersonal actions, intent may play a much smaller role in the case of purity violations. So to test these hypotheses, we presented subjects with a series of harm scenarios like this one here. So in this example, imagine your cousin is over for dinner. In the intentional case, you know she's allergic to peanuts, but you decide to add the peanuts to the dish anyway because they make the dish really flavorful for you. Whereas in the case of an accident, you really have no idea that your cousin is allergic. Okay, and then in a purity case, this is a case of incest. We also included cases of pathogen violations, eating really gross things. Imagine you're on a party and hit it off with someone. This person feels the same way about you. That night you end up talking. In the intentional case, you know your long-lost siblings, and then at the end of the night you decide to sleep together. In the case of an accident, you have no idea that you're long-lost siblings. So intentional versus accidental incest. And what we hypothesize here is that accidental harms would be judged less morally wrong than accidental incest based on information about the mental state, what the person meant to do, whether they had a false belief or an innocent intention. So what we found was, first of all, no difference between domains in the case of intentional violations. So the y-axis here goes from not at all morally wrong at 1 at the bottom to 7 very morally wrong at the top. And we actually designed our stimuli to be relatively matched in severity in the case of intentional violations. But we did find the predicted difference in the case of accidents, such that accidental harms are in fact judged that are not as morally wrong compared to accidental purity violations based on mental state information. We also tested the complementary hypothesis that failed attempts to harm would be judged morally worse than failed attempts to commit incest. So to give you some examples of attempted violations in the case of an attempted harm, your cousin is over again, you think she's allergic to peanuts, turns out she's not. Nonetheless, you decide to add peanuts to the dish. So you think that you're going to give your cousin an allergic reaction. And in the case of attempted incest, you think you're siblings, you're actually not, and then you make the decision to sleep together. And so here are the results. Again, we found the same effect in the case of accidents, such that innocent intentions reduce the amount of blame for an accident, but more so in the case of harm than for purity. And we also found a difference in the case of attempts, such that guilty intentions increase the amount of blame, but more so for harm than for purity. Okay, so what we take these behavioral data to suggest is distinct cognitive signatures for distinct moral domains for harm and purity. More specifically, that mental states matter a great deal in our moral judgments of harmful actions and relatively less in the case of purity violations. A related alternative, though, is that theory of mind is equally deployed across domains, that subjects construct representations of mental states for both kinds of judgments, but then for whatever reason assign less weight to that information in one case versus the other. And so here, neuroimaging becomes a really useful way to test these hypotheses. In particular, what we want to see is whether neural mechanisms like the RTPJ that support mental state reasoning are differentially recruited for these different kinds of moral judgments, or alternatively, do we see approximately the same levels of activation across domains in spite of the distinct behavioral patterns. And in addition, what we'd want to look at is whether there's any neural evidence to support the representation of the act as intentional or accidental in the domain of harm, but not in the domain of purity. So is there any neural evidence for the key cognitive computations in one case but not the other? So here we scanned participants while they read a series of the same sorts of moral scenarios that I just showed you, but in the following cumulative sequence. So first, some background information was presented to set the scene. It followed by the action, the outcome, and the information about the intent, whether the act was intentional or accidental. The actual stimuli that we used were a little bit richer in detail, but these are just for illustrative purposes. And again, the reason for the sequential presentation was so that we could see when, during the time course, at what point in the stimulus, any neural differences might emerge. And as we predicted, the RTPJ was significantly higher in its overall response when people were making moral judgments of harmful actions versus purity violations like incest, whether those violations were intentional or accidental. And I just want to note that the difference that we're seeing in the RTPJ between domains emerges relatively early in the stimulus. So at the time of the outcome, we see this difference, even though subjects aren't yet reading any information about the intent. And we wouldn't have known this just from looking at the behavioral data alone, that subjects were engaging in spontaneous mental state inference even before mental states were available to them. What's interesting, though, is that even when we do make intent information available to the subject, the RTPJ response doesn't distinguish between intentional and accidental harms insofar as its response is equally high for both intentional harms and accidental harms, which is an interesting puzzle because we know that subjects are making this distinction in their behavioral judgments. Intentional harms are way worse than accidents. And so the question arises of how and where is this information about the dimension of intent, where is that being represented? How is that being represented? And so what we've found quite recently using multi-voxel pattern analysis, or MVPA, is that this dimension of intent is encoded in the response of the RTPJ, not in the mean signal averaged across all of the voxels in the region, but rather in the pattern of voxels within the region, within the RTPJ. So more specifically, the voxel-wise pattern in the RTPJ distinguishes between intentional harms and accidental harms, but not between intentional harms, not between intentional incest, for instance, and accidental incest. So just to walk you through these data, with respect to the pattern in the RTPJ, intentional harms are correlated with other intentional harms. Accidental harms are correlated with other accidental harms. It's not the case, though, that we get correlations across intentional harms and accidental harms. This is true for harm, but it's not true for purity. I know that this analysis is a little complicated, so we can talk about this after if people want. What I do want to flag, which I think is really interesting, is that the extent to which the pattern of activity in this region distinguishes between intentional and accidental harms is correlated with the extent to which subjects distinguish between intentional and accidental harms in their behavioral judgments. So what you can see here is that subjects who show a greater pattern discrimination in this region also show a greater behavioral difference in their moral judgments of accidents and intentional harms. And we've seen this more recently in an older data set, actually, that we reanalyzed using different subjects on slightly different stimuli. And then one last bit of data for this part here. We run high-functioning autistics on the same moral judgment task, looking at harm and purity violations that are intentional or accidental, and the RTPJ in high-functioning autism does not distinguish between intentional and accidental harms or intentional and accidental purity violations, and really neither does any other region. So what I think these neural and behavioral data show is that harmful actions seem to elicit more attention to agents' mental states. They seem to rely more on specific cognitive computations for distinguishing intentional acts from accidental acts. I think these findings also provide a window into the distinct roles of harm norms and purity norms. So purity norms, rules against incest, eating taboo foods, may have evolved for our own good to protect ourselves from possible contamination, food, people, and so on. And when we're concerned about negatively impacting ourselves, we care less about whether we do so intentionally or accidentally. We really just want to avoid the bad outcome. Harm norms, though, may have evolved to limit our negative impact on each other. And especially in the case of accidents, it's really important that we know somebody's true intentions to make predictions about what they're going to do to you or to your friends in the future, and also to make these more general assessments of whether they're your friend or your foe. And so in general, when we're trying to understand and interpret other people's behavior, it's really important that we know what's going on inside, whereas this seems to be less relevant for ourselves. It's not as often that we think, who am I, what am I doing, what are my intentions, can I try to explain my behavior, unless someone from the outside prompts you to do so. And so this brings me to the second question, which is whether, as a result of that, we are less likely to spontaneously construct representations of our own mental states as opposed to other people's mental states? And then more immediately, do we weigh our own mental states less when we're making judgments of ourselves? So I'm going to show you some pilot behavioral data here. We relied on 4 moral scenarios that manipulated the dimensions of intent and perspective. So actions were intentional or accidental, and they were either in the second person or the third person. So here's an example of a third person story where this figure skater named Kelly either accidentally or intentionally sabotages her skating competitor. And then subjects are asked, how morally wrong is Kelly's behavior? Another group of subjects saw the same scenarios but in the second person, and then they were asked, how morally wrong is your behavior? And the prediction here is that subjects would perceive a smaller difference due to intent for the self than for the other. And more specifically, that subjects would judge their own accidents more wrong, focusing more on what they did, their external effects on the world, than on what was inside, than on what they meant to do. And that's the pattern that we found. So subjects judged their own accidents more harshly than other people's accidents, even though they weren't, in general, harsher on themselves. The same sorts of patterns emerged for judgments of moral character and also judgments of punishment. So what could account for this pattern? On the one hand, we have access to the contents of our minds. We should be able to use that information in making judgments, particularly in these hypothetical scenarios. And so maybe it's just the fact that we assign less weight to this information to mental states when we're computing punishment, character, and wrongness for ourselves, for whatever reason. An alternative is that we're actually worse at thinking about our own thoughts, reasoning about our own mental states. So I'm going to say more about this intuition. In general, we can act on our beliefs without representing our beliefs as beliefs. So we might think lots of thoughts without thinking about our thoughts as thoughts. If I spoon sugar into my coffee, I might think this is sugar without explicitly attributing to myself the belief that this is sugar, unless maybe after a few minutes I start feeling ill, and then I might think back to the fact that while I thought it was sugar, maybe it was poison. And so the suggestion here is that belief attribution to the self may happen rarely, and usually only when beliefs turn out to be false or to have bad consequences, or maybe both, like in this case here. Whereas we frequently attribute beliefs to other people spontaneously in order to make sense of their behavior, to figure out who they are and what they're doing and what they're going to do next. So to test the hypothesis that we're actually worse at theorizing about our own minds than other people's minds, we devised an experiment to test how people think about their own thoughts versus other people's thoughts. So here we scanned participants while they viewed a series of pictures. There were 48 pictures in total. 36 of them were presented first, like this one here, where they were partially occluded, so you couldn't see the whole picture. A third of these partially occluded pictures were like this one in that they were actually misleading. So here the part looks like a fish, but the whole thing is a snake. So these misleading pictures might lead you to form a false belief about the content of the picture. Another third of the pictures were veridical, so they gave rise to true beliefs, and another third of the pictures contained sort of insufficient detail in that part for you to figure out what the heck was going on. In the first part of the task, subjects had to complete this word association task where they had to choose one of 4 words that they thought was best associated with what the picture would show. So here, the correct word is crawl, because that's what snakes do. The lower word is swim, because that's what fish do. So subjects would go through the word association task, and then in the reveal task, they were able to press a button to reveal the full picture, to see what it contained. And then in the final phase, during the think task, subjects were instructed to think back to what they thought the picture was at the time of the word task, and then to choose one of the following response options. I was right, I was wrong, or this is new. So the this is new response pertains to 12 out of the 48 pictures that were presented only at this time here in their entirety. And so for a trial like this, subjects probably would have been wrong in phase 1, and they probably would have chosen I was wrong at phase 3. Another group of subjects participated in the other condition, where first they saw the part picture, and then they saw the full thing. And then this time during the word task, they were told that another person who hadn't seen the full pictures would complete the word association task. So they, the subject, would see what the other person responded on their screen. So the subject might see that the other person chose swim. And then at the time of the think task, the subject was told, think back to what the other person thought the picture was and choose one of the response options. So what we first looked at was the accuracy with which people retrieved their own beliefs versus other people's beliefs. And as predicted, we found that people were less accurate at retrieving their own beliefs versus other people's beliefs, whether those beliefs were right or wrong, whether they were true or false to begin with. We didn't find any difference in accuracy between self and other for judgments of this is a new picture, it hasn't been shown before. We did, however, find a weak, somewhat unexpected neural difference for this condition here in the comparison between self and other. More specifically, we found marginally more activity in the RTBJ when subjects had to judge that another person hadn't seen a picture than when they had to judge that they themselves hadn't seen the picture. And so this partially suggests that maybe when we have to judge whether an image is familiar or novel to ourselves, we just introspect on our current experience. But when we have to judge whether someone else has or hasn't seen something, we might spontaneously think about their mental states and represent their mental states. And this maybe speaks more generally to that earlier intuition that, in general, when we try to interpret other people's actions, we might obligatorily think about what's going on inside. Now, we did find another interesting difference in the self condition for subjects in the self condition. This comparison between trials where subjects were explicitly instructed to think back to their prior thoughts to make this judgment, was I right or was I wrong, versus trials where subjects just had to say whether they had seen the picture or not before. And again, here we find that there's more RTBJ activation when subjects had to explicitly think about their thoughts than when they simply had to look at the picture and say whether it was new. So this difference here suggests that simply thinking thoughts in response to a new picture doesn't rely on the same neural mechanisms as representing those thoughts as thoughts per se. So what's interesting about these data is that while we might have introspective access to the contents of our minds, because we don't spontaneously construct representations of these mental states, it might be more difficult for us to retrieve those states after the fact. And this suggests that mental state reasoning might serve a special function for understanding the actions of other people in terms of their unobservable mental states. This then allows us to make assessments of friend or foe and to predict and explain other people's behavior. And again, what I'm suggesting is that these sorts of computations may be less relevant for the self. We already know our own friend or foe status. We don't necessarily need to predict or explain our behavior unless an experimenter asks us, like in that experiment I just showed you. How am I doing on time?
It's been about a half hour.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, so just to wrap up, what I showed you in the first part is that moral judgments rely on neural substrates that are dedicated to mental state processing. This process matters more for our moral judgments of harmful actions, interpersonal harms, than purity violations. Harm norms may operate mostly in interpersonal contexts to protect us from each other, whereas purity norms may protect us from ourselves, so to speak. Related to this, mental states may matter more for our judgments of other people than judgments of the self, and even retrieving that information about ourselves may be an unexpected challenge because we don't spontaneously construct representations of our own mental states. So what I think this shows is that, above all, mental state reasoning allows us to make sense of other people, to explain and predict their behavior, and maybe most importantly, to understand and evaluate the people around us as potential social partners. Thanks.
Would you like to come forward, or did it turn out we can't pass the microphones fast enough? Is that? I suspect some people would ask questions if they can stay in place rather than line up. So should we? Okay, well, good.
Could you interpret the purity response in terms of Josh Green's idea of moral intuition? It seems like purity is more of an intuitive response, whereas attribution might be more cognitive.
Yes. I think that both purity and harm judgments may have some so-called cognitive component, maybe in this case theory of mind, but to differing degrees, like I showed you, and some affective component too. So other folks have shown, including James Blair, and more recently we have some pilot data suggesting that there's a correlation between different kinds of emotional responses and moral judgments across domains. So how upset you are or how angry you are when you read a story about harm predicts how wrong you think the harmful action is, whereas in the case of purity, how disgusted you are or how unnatural you find the particular action to be is predictive of your moral response to the purity violation. So in both cases, there may be affective components, but there might be different, qualitatively different emotional responses. This also goes back to Paul Rosin's work on the CAD hypothesis, community, authority, divinity tracks with contempt, anger, and disgust. So there's reason to think that both depend on both.
Hi, thank you. I found your talk completely fascinating. I am wondering whether you have thought about accidental harms in relationship to the concept of moral luck. And because as you are speaking about the way that one tends to hold oneself responsible for one's own accidental harms, I thought about, you're probably familiar with Bernard Williams' example of the lorry driver who hits the child, and Williams' remark about it is that the driver will blame himself even while other people are trying to talk him out of blaming himself. And so it occurred to me that's a case where in relationship to himself, the lorry driver is being unforgiving about an accidental harm. But then the second part of my question is that part of the discussion about moral luck, part of the argument is that we need to blame ourselves for our actions that are a mixture of agency and lack of control, because we need to live in a world in which people take responsibility for those sorts of acts. Otherwise, so many needs will go unmet because no one is responsible for them. They are not in anyone's control. So I wonder whether, you're kind of thinking about why would we maybe evolutionarily need less to think about our own mental states and other people's mental states.
Yeah.
I wonder whether we also need to blame ourselves for our own accidental harms so that we do take responsibility for those cases where there's a bad outcome due to a mixture of our own agency and something outside of our control.
Yeah, that's a super interesting spin and kind of the opposite spin from the one in my talk. So there are various pieces there that I want to get at. The first is this broader issue of moral luck. I have looked at moral luck as far as people's behavioral and neural responses go. So you mentioned that famous case by Williams. We have a series of, I think, 96 of these moral luck cases, from the father being negligent and letting his son drown in the bathtub and so on for other reasons. What we did in that particular experiment was unconfound two dimensions that are usually confounded and that were confounded in pretty much all the examples that I showed, which is the truth of the belief and the valence of the outcome. So in the cases that I showed you with the poison and the sugar, if somebody has a false belief, they think it's sugar, but it's poison, somebody dies. So there's a false belief and there's a bad outcome in that case. Not to mention, I didn't address the dimension of justification of the belief, right? Whether or not there was good reason for that person to have that particular belief, even though it was a false belief in the end. So in this experiment, we varied the dimension of justification such that there was either a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason for the particular belief, which is related, I think, to the discussion about moral luck. And also, there were three other conditions, combinations of truth and outcome, such that someone could have a true belief in sugar, and there was a good outcome because nobody died, and a false belief, they thought it was sugar, but it was poison, somebody died. versus they had a false belief, they thought it was sugar, it was poison, but then just as they were about to drink the poison coffee, they spilled it, so good outcome. And what we found out of those three dimensions was that the justification or the reasonableness of the belief mattered the most for moral judgments, followed by whether the belief was true or false, followed by whether the outcome was good or bad. The fMRI piece was also interesting insofar as we found significantly higher activity in that region that is supposed to do mental state reasoning very late in the stimulus for bad outcomes. So once subjects had made a negative moral judgment of the fact that somebody died, there was a peak in activity suggesting that they might have gone back and reassessed the mental state, which showed up in the behavioral pattern too. So if there was a bad outcome, you think they should have known, the belief wasn't reasonable, it wasn't justified. So all of this is to say that the standard moral luck cases, which seem to reflect this big outcome bias, might actually be related to this post hoc reassessment of the belief to like hindsight bias, but specific to reassessing mental state information. The second part about self and other, I find really, really interesting because I had been thinking about the difference between harm and purity and self and other as one where intentions don't matter for the self because those are cases where you are just thinking about yourself. So if I cut myself, it doesn't matter if I did it intentionally or accidentally, it just matters that now I'm hurt. Whereas what you're suggesting is that you need to be particularly careful about regulating your own actions so that you don't hurt other people, and that's why intentions don't matter, and that's something that I'll have to think more about.
Thanks.
I was wondering if you'd be willing to say more about the relationship between purity and harm to self. I remember in the experiment that you described for us, you had like 5 purity vignettes or something like that. You emphasized one of them, the incest one, but I saw in your data there was like eating horse meat and drinking urine and I can't remember what else. And I certainly, I don't know anything about eating horse meat, but I don't think it would be harmful or anything more harmful than just eating any other kind of meat. Incest, I mean, maybe in sort of a more extrapolated kind of evolutionary sense. It's not really a harm. It's more like a lack of benefit or something. But so I was wondering why you wanted to use, why you thought that those were good purity examples to use, given that you were trying to see if it was all about sort of protecting oneself from harm.
Yeah, so you just articulated the explanation that I would ultimately support, which is that I think that a lot of these purity responses, disgust responses, do come from cases where you are trying to avoid things that are actually harmful, and now they've been co-opted for these moral purposes, right? So you could have a moral response to eating a taboo food that comes out of your, response way back in ancestral time to eating rotten meat, right?
Okay.
That seems totally not moralized, but now that response, again, this is
so it's an indirect. So the process of reasoning is indirect. It's not just it's horse meat, I might be harming myself. It's horse meat, that's taboo, I might be harming myself. Or
in fact, I don't even know whether the I might be harming myself ever emerges in our consciousness.
Okay.
I think that, and again, a lot of the earlier work by John Haidt suggests this too, which is that we might have an initial response to the story about Mark and Julie, the brother and sister who commit incest, where we say, that's wrong, and then it's not until like 10 minutes later that we think about all of the possible reasons why it could be, which turn out not to matter anyway, that have to do with self-harm, as it were.
Okay, thank you.
Is it?
Going back to the fish and the snake, I'm just curious if, considering the stimulus and priming the subjects, if it's a consideration at all, if the image itself, the drawing illustration, is deceptively drawn or poorly drawn, and whether or not that affects your results at all, that the kind of interpretation then you're giving at another level.
So with respect to the images, there were a series of 48 images that were probably similar in skill and quality to the one that I showed on the slide. Skill or quality wasn't a dimension that we altered, although one of the key dimensions was whether or not the drawing was misleading, not because it was not a very good drawing. I think the drawings were pretty good. They were done by a graduate student, Hyo Kwon, but some were designed to be misleading, but still skillfully done. So I'm not. What's the prediction about skill?
I'm wondering if the subjects at all felt misled, and whether or not they were angry as a result, and that affected then the outcomes or the reliability, the validity of the results that you were looking at.
That's interesting. I don't know whether the subjects were upset. I think they found it to be a fun experiment. On the first round, I thought it would be enough to just include the misleading pictures, but there's an obvious problem there, which is that you just know, well, all of these pictures are going to turn out to be something else, so I might as well just guess randomly because, and in fact, I should guess whatever thing I don't think this thing is because it's bound to be misleading. In fact, only a third of the pictures were misleading. As for the more specific question of whether or not subjects were angry at us and whether or not that would have produced this particular pattern of results, I'm not sure. I mean, a question that I sometimes get is whether subjects are thinking about the mind of the experimenter when they're engaging in the experiment. So are they not in fact thinking about the person who's putting poison in the coffee, but are they thinking about the person who wrote the story about the person who's putting poison in the coffee? And that may be the case, but then I don't think that we would find, I don't think that we would necessarily find these differences between conditions. You might just find more activity. Well, I'm not even sure how you would test that. What we don't see is just more activity for the misleading picture. So if it were the case that subjects were thinking more about what is this experimenter trying to do for the misleading pictures, we didn't see that.
I have a follow-up question to the last two. Partly, how did you, following up Ben's thing, how did you decide on what goes into the category of purity or defilement? And the reason I think, my question is this, that seems very both compendious and possibly for some of those misleading. And it might be something like this. It seems to me the responses to incest might differ. Some people might experience shame, others guilt, but perhaps neither a sense of defilement of the sort that eating forbidden foods, which might seem like literally I have poisoned myself. Not I haven't harmed myself, but as it were in terms of virtue, I have harmed myself. So the methodological question is partly how did you hit on the examples, but another methodological, do you follow up with these subjects as to why they had the reactions, say, with regard to purity that they did? Because I would have thought people might differ. With regard to harm, it seems to me there isn't this kind of multiplicity of reasons. I mean, not that there aren't different kinds of harm and severity, but harming someone, it seems to me, the reasons, you might have reasons in some cases that would justify. But with regard to these other things, it seems to me there might be a variety of reactions, and would they come out if you had a follow-up with your students as to why they had the reaction they did? And would that ever suggest a further, more refined experiment to see whether those, say, to take my example, experience shame, actually were lighting up differently from those who experienced guilt, from those who felt just a kind of revolted sense of having, as you said, defiled yourself?
That's a really interesting set of questions. So with respect to shame and guilt, which came up at the beginning and the end of your question, my graduate student, James Dunyan, had the same intuition, and he ran a pilot experiment which failed, I should say that up front, but he asked people to write about experiences that elicited either guilt or shame, and what he found in the responses, which I don't think this is going to work out, but he shared your intuition, and what he found in a first round was that the shame responses elicited purity type violations, stuff that was directed at the self, or like overeating or whatever that didn't seem to involve interpersonal context. The reason why I'm talking about this is I think there is still a part of this that's true. And the guilt responses related to interpersonal actions, cases where you hurt or disappointed another person, and also the content was more harm-based. So putting that aside, because those particular data did not work out in the end, what he did do before that, which I think is really interesting and relevant here, and also in collaboration with one of Josh's grad students, Alec Chakrav, found that it might not be so much the content of the behavior that matters, but whether it is directed at the self or directed at another person, which gets at your other question about how we decide to categorize this particular action pattern as in the harm domain or in the purity domain. The way that we did that was by looking at papers by John Haidt and other folks. But setting that aside, what James and Alec have found is that things that are directed at other people, whether they might be on the face of them seem defiling or seem harmful, are thought of as more harmful. Things that you do to the self, whether on the face of those actions seem more like defiling or more like harm, are categorized as defiling, unnatural, impure. And so a simple case would be, well, so here's one example which is slightly different from the design that I just mentioned, but was one of the earlier experiments. The thought experiment to begin with, which formed the basis of the actual experiment, was whether or not if you had the choice to either deliver a minor electric shock to someone or to spray fart spray at them, which one would you choose? And then for yourself, would you prefer to deliver a minor electric shock to yourself or to spray fart spray on yourself? The intuition there was that you would prefer to spray someone and shock yourself, even if it wasn't a forced choice. So you could spray yourself and the other person, you could shock yourself and the other person, but that's not the pattern that we found. Over a range of so-called purity and harm violations, you really don't want to harm the other person, and you really don't want to defile yourself. And in some follow-ups, we found this was the case for both action choices and also moral judgments. And intent also seems to matter more for anything that you direct at someone else, and less so for anything that you direct at yourself, independent of the so-called content of the domain.
So my question was, if you took these questions, these moral questions, and put them in the domain of humor, it kind of changes the context.
Speak up a bit.
If you put these moral questions in the domain of humor, it kind of changes the context. And I was wondering if there have been any studies that show how humor would affect, for example, activity in the RTPJ, if you have the question of someone accidentally or even intentionally poisoning someone, if it's a cartoon that's doing it, as opposed to a very bland sort of depiction.
That's interesting. Yes, I often get chuckles when I describe the scenarios with the cartoons, but I should note that no cartoons were shown in this manner, so nobody was chuckling. So this isn't something that I've looked at, and I'm not sure what my intuitions are, but Nina Sturminger has looked at different kinds of positive affect and their effect on trolley problem intuitions. So some of you might be familiar with a neat study from a while back by Carlo Valdesolo and Dave DeSteno showing that when people watch clips of Chris Farley on Saturday Night Live, they then are more likely to push the man off the bridge. And so this was taken to be in broad support of the dual process model and to suggest that, you know, positive emotions that reduce negative emotions lead to a certain pattern of behavioral responding. What Nina was interested in doing was parsing or separating out different kinds of positive affect. So I can't remember the term that she used for the thing that wasn't awe or elevation, but sort of the low level, like, chuckle that you might have when you watch SNL. That is distinct from sort of, I guess, maybe what John Haidt would call awe or elevation. And so humor, even though humor and awe might both be positive and maybe both do some work in reducing negative affect, seem to function differently. But I don't know whether you had a more specific intuition about humor and mental state reasoning. I guess you need to understand mental states to get the joke.
Yeah, it's more of a, yeah, like that. And it's also, if, for example, would you see a change in the signal in the RTPJ? Would it be more pronounced if it was a cartoon that was being displayed to do these kind of morally wrong situations, as opposed to like putting someone in a very serious context where they have to imagine the mental state of somebody else? If you're trying to imagine the mental state of a cartoon doing it, it's not exactly the same as imagining the mental state of a real person. So I imagine that there would be a sort of different response, but there might not be, in which case it would be interesting anyway, because it's a virtual representation of a human being.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's the difference between serious and light, because there are probably lots of serious instances in which you would try really, really hard to think about what someone thinks about you. Like, you don't know if someone likes you in the context of a romantic relationship, then maybe that's more serious, and you have to think really hard about what they're thinking. But, you know, maybe in the case of humor, like, you would find differences between people who get the joke and people who don't in processing mental states. But that's really going out on a limb there. I don't have a strong intuition, but it seems interesting. I agree.
Also, it would be interesting. So much humor is on the face of it, so clearly aggressive. It would be interesting that people might think that some humor is personally aggressive, as opposed just that the current tendency of much humor is just aggressive. Anyway. Yes, was there? Yes.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you are doing. I would like to know your opinion regarding critique that has been raised towards this kind of research and to many other kinds of research done in cognitive psychology, given the fact that it is majorly done with American undergraduate students, so with young students, and given what we know about ontogenesis of moral development and the fact that prefrontal cortex kind of develops or matures somewhere in the mid-20s, and also when you think at yourself how your moral world has been when you are around 20. So it might be that we are kind of dealing with immature moral brains. And so my question is that does this also apply to your research? So is this also basically based on kind of relatively young subjects? And B, do you think that this actually could affect your results?
Yeah, unfortunately, that does apply to most of my research, that our subjects are mostly weird, right? Western, educated, industrialized, etc. And so I think that particularly in the domain of morality, it would be really important to study different populations and older and younger adults. What I can say, though, is that the few times when we've looked at behavioral patterns over the lifespan, we haven't seen any differences between older and younger adults in the extent to which mental state information is used, nor have we found any effects of gender or political orientation, or pretty much any dimension that you might find interesting or have an intuition about with respect to mental state reasoning and moral judgment. We're certainly interested in political differences, not so much related to this research I talked about today, but with respect to, and again, maybe John Haidt will talk about this tomorrow, with respect to the differential valuing of different kinds of moral concerns. Although I should say that you might have thought that there would be political differences in moral judgments of harm and purity violations for this case here. In the very limited sample that we had, which was mostly Harvard and MIT undergraduates and mostly liberal, we didn't find any differences in moral judgments of these cases, but that's something that we're interested in pursuing. The data that I didn't present on how we attribute minds to groups, there's a piece of it that looks at how Republicans attribute mind to Democrats and vice versa, both in a group context and an individual context. But again, that's something that I'm looking to explore more.
We have time, I think, for one more question or comment.
I just had a question about the idea of what we heard about earlier in terms of manual and point and shoot ideas and relating that to purity and harm, because from what you said, I thought with the harmful that there was more manual moral reasoning and that you looked at intention and outcome, whereas with the purity it was just instinctive, even though they weren't necessarily physically harmful, or just like, you know, if I thought about eating dog meat, I would be pretty disgusted, even though I'm not sure what it would do to me. So if you've ever considered that.
Yeah, there are two things that I want to point out there. First of all, that's a really interesting question. The first is that it might seem on the face of it that purity judgments are just dumber, so to speak, than harm judgments because they seem to be less flexible. I presented you those data suggesting that harm depends on two factors, purity seems to depend mostly on one factor. What I didn't show you was an experiment looking at two different kinds of attempted violations, so an attempt to commit a violation but failure to do so. So in the case of harm, you could attempt to harm someone attempt to harm and fail to do so in different ways. So the case I showed you was due to a false belief. You think your cousin is allergic to peanuts, she's not, you don't end up harming her. Another case could be you think your cousin is allergic to peanuts, she is allergic to peanuts, but then at the last minute you run out of peanuts, so you just give her walnuts instead. And what subjects are asked is to make a decision based on the person's decision to put the peanuts in originally. So those are two kinds of attempted harms. It turns out that that difference between true and false belief just doesn't matter at all in people's moral judgments. People think that the initial decision to put the peanuts in is just as wrong. In the case of purity, I'll give you a case of two kinds of attempted incest. So the case that I showed you, you think you're siblings, you're not, you failed to commit incest, versus you think you're siblings and you are, or your cousins or whatever, but then right as you're about to sleep together, the fire alarm goes off, so you can't. And so again, the judgment there is of the decision to sleep with a person, and there people really distinguish between those two cases on the basis of the belief, or whether the belief tracks with something about the truth of the world, whether or not you actually are related or aren't related. So people think it's way worse for you to almost sleep with a person who actually is your sibling than to actually sleep with a person thinking they're your sibling but they're not. And so that's the case where it seems like the purity judgments are actually quite nuanced in tracking this dimension about the structure of the world in the mind as opposed to the judgments of harm. But in general, I kind of share your intuition, and there's other sorts of data that seem related, like for instance, purity judgments seem to track with the disposition of the person. You think that somebody who, eats the dog is going to do it again and again and again, but the person who hits someone might not be a hitter. So that's something that we're looking at.
Well, I think we all appreciate the fact that you've added considerably interesting categories to the trolley problem. And we thank you for the kinds of interesting stuff you introduced. Thank you.